Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum. We range from center-left to center-right. I'm Mona Charon, syndicated columnist and policy editor at the Bulwark, and I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Damon Linker of The Week, and Linda Chavez of the Niskanen Center. Our special guest this week is Washington Post columnist Megan McArdle, making a return visit, and we're always thrilled to have her. So let us start with the woes of Governor Cuomo. The report came out this week by the New York Attorney General, Letitia James, documenting accusations against Cuomo, not just from the original women who had come forward, but from a grand total of 11. There were 179 witnesses that they heard from. And it paints a pretty bad picture of Cuomo's behavior, including hitting on and really sexually harassing in the grossest way his one of members of his security detail and others. So I'm going to start with you, Damon Linker. We've seen this movie before in different iterations, of course. What do you make of the comparison to, say, Ralph Northam or Bill Clinton or Donald Trump, who all decided that they were going to adopt a strategy of just fighting it, denying everything, and bullying their way through?
Well, that clearly is what Cuomo appears still eager to try to do. We shall see how successful it would be. I don't think in any of those cases you had quite the preponderance of people in his own in the person's own party lining up so quickly to say, yeah, gotta go. And that includes a majority of the Democratic majority. Well, it includes the Democratic majority in the New York State Assembly. And that, of course, is where the rubber really is going to hit the road. But to have the President of the United States himself say on the very day that this report was released that Cuomo should resign, that's a lot of pressure. So I think the real comparison here would be to the Al Franken case, where Al Franken, former senator from Minnesota, resigned or was pushed to resign when sexual harassment allegations were made. And there was a lot of debate among Democrats at the time, and then subsequently asking, maybe did we act too quickly, move too fast to gut the career of one of our most promising members. But the accusations against Cuomo are far more severe, and they all took place much more recently and to people on his own staff. And so I think what we're seeing here is actually, the most important aspect of it, I think, has to be seen in the context of the kind of Trumpification of our politics, and the fact that even after we had a president who did and confessed to on tape some of the things that Trump did and all the accusations of rape that have floated around him for years with no real consequence, and his party not really doing anything about it or treating it as anything to disqualify him. You have the Democrats very clearly standing up here and saying, this guy should go for this behavior. And that shows, I think, a very real difference between the parties that persists. The Democrats might have all kinds of problems and defects and weaknesses that I'm sure will come up at other points in this podcast. But on this issue, I do think that they are behaving much more admirably than their partisan rivals in Washington.
Megan, one of the things that people say about the Al Franken case was that the Democrats pushed him out to own the cons, as it were, to prove that they were willing to hold one of their own accountable. But it strikes me that some of the problems that arise in these kinds of situations is the failure to make distinctions. What Franken was accused of was so trivial compared to what we're dealing with Cuomo. Don't you agree?
Oh, I think that's right. But, I think that the way to look at this is not quite as like, well, they're doing better than Trump. I think what we see with this pattern is that two things determine whether you are going to be forced out or not. And the first is, is your exit going to empower the other party or your own power or your own party? And I
Hmm.
think in the case of Al Franken, right, it was cheap to push him out because, of course, he was getting replaced by a Democrat.
Right.
In the case of Bill Clinton, it was not cheap to push him out. Even though he was going to be replaced by a Democrat, it would cripple the party's chances going into the 2000 elections, or so it was perceived. And therefore, the party rallied behind him. Andrew Cuomo had the bad luck to choose to do all of this or as it is alleged anyway,
Hmm.
in the state of New York, where Democrats control. And so you can't make the argument that, like, you guys need to stand behind me because otherwise the Republicans are going to take over. So the next question is, are you kind of shameless enough to refuse to resign? And we saw this with Ralph Northam, right? It's
Yep.
not just Donald Trump, because Donald Trump was playing the same thing. Was for his supporters, it was, well, if we lose him, there's no one like him that we can just put into place.
Hmm.
And so, Northam had a Democratic lieutenant governor. However, that Democratic lieutenant governor was having his own scandals,
Yep.
and he just stuck, and his base forgave him. The last polling that I saw had indicated that Black New Yorkers, for example, were still standing behind him, and that's a really important base in New York State. And I think that what he is hoping is that, while for the activist base of the party, this is a big deal and is going to trigger a lot of pressure, for the actual voters, they may just not care as much as the activists do. And that if he just sticks it out, they're probably not going to be able to get up enough juice to impeach him. The question is, can they find other means of pressure? Can they get donors to pressure him? Can they get the president to say, I will make it hard for the state of New York if you do not, resign in favor of someone else? And I don't know the answer to that, but I actually tend to suspect that he can probably survive if he sticks in it. His future in Democratic politics will probably be over, but I think that was sealed at the moment that the report came out.
Linda, when you look into what the impeachment inquiry, which has been going on for many months in the New York legislature, what they're looking into, the sexual harassment allegations are just one thing. They're also looking into the fact that, or the allegations, I should say, that the governor monkeyed around with nursing home death data and attempted to hide the data, which is a pretty serious offense, that he may have used state resources to help write his memoir, which is maybe a little more trivial. And then finally, this one I had not heard of until I did a little research, that he covered up structural problems on the Mario Cuomo Bridge, which is the bridge that's replacing the Tappan Zee. Apparently, there were all these, joints and things that were breaking, and apparently they tried to cover that up. That's kind of concerning.
It is concerning, and I will say I think he's toast.
Okay,
And
all right.
I don't say that with any glee. I'm actually a fan of Governor Cuomo. I was one of those people who tuned in every day during the beginning of the pandemic to listen to his briefings. He was a steadying voice who was focusing on science and was a reassuring figure at a time when you had Donald Trump in the White House, who was anything but. So, and I think he's been a good governor, and I think he's, represents a somewhat more moderate wing of the Democratic Party, and I find that attractive. So I don't say it with pleasure at all, but I don't think he can withstand this. And I think you're exactly right. It's not just the allegations of sexual misbehavior. And by the way, they are very different than some of the scandals. I think the closest that comes to it is Bill Clinton. And even though that was considered a consensual relationship, she was a very young woman. And most feminists, if the name had been something other than with a D behind it, probably would have found the activity that took place sexual harassment because of the imbalance in power between President and Ms. Lewinsky. But I do think that it's not just the sexual behavior. It is also this administration of his, from reading these reports, sounds like such an incredibly toxic environment to work in. I mean, the screaming, the intimidation,
the threats of retaliation.
Retaliation, yeah. That, the staff that is around him and protects him is kind of a palace guard. This is very, very unattractive. And I think is not something that most people, would approve of. And I think he's, as I say, I think he's toast. I think there are enough calls. He does not want to go through an impeachment. And you've got enough state legislators now coming forward and saying the impeachment is going to proceed if he does not resign, that I think it's going to take him, maybe it'll take him a week, maybe it'll take him a couple of weeks. But I cannot imagine that he wants to subject himself to an impeachment. It will ruin him for, a future life, sitting on corporate boards, doing other kinds of things that people in high office do after they leave office. That I don't.
Well, that's close to him anyway. I think.
Probably for a while. Yeah, probably. But he could go out and make money. I think still. But if he's impeached, that's not going to happen.
Yeah. Bill, I'm going to come to you now with an observation that I have a feeling, knowing you're not going to want to weigh in on. So I'm going to just make this observation. If you care to comment on it, please do. If not, I will pitch you a different question. But my comment is that that there is this tendency. Look, we all agree that this behavior is gross and unacceptable and, worthy of being hounded from office over. But there's a tendency that I have noticed, especially on outlets like NPR, to treat women in such an infantilizing fashion. What do I mean? Well, they say, we're now going to bring you a report about Mario Cuomo. Alert for sexual abuse, sufferers. This contains possibly disturbing information. And then they present the story and they say, he grabbed somebody, he kissed somebody without asking, and I listen to that and I think, come on, women are not, they're not little fragile snowflakes, to use an overworked phrase. But honestly, the notion that we can't even hear words like a man grabbed a woman's breast without, needing a fainting couch is insulting. So you can comment on that if you want. If not, I have a different question for you.
As Groucho famously said, ladies and gentlemen, these are my principles, and if you don't like them, I've got others.
Right.
Look, I think, frankly, Mona, that you have, to put it as delicately as possible, standing to speak on that question that I don't.
Okay.
Right. I'm in no position to pronounce on what women do or should find insulting. And, if there was ever a time in my life when I might have been tempted to pronounce on that question, that time is long past.
Okay. All right. Well, is there anything else that you care to comment on about the whole Cuomo business?
Yes, there is. And that is that there is, not just a political dimension to this, but also a legal dimension. I actually sat down and read the New York State criminal statutes of sexual harassment. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, much of the conduct detailed in the Attorney General's report falls squarely under the forcible touching title of that statute. Mm-hmm. And so there is some real criminal jeopardy here. I would think it unfortunate if it went in that direction. There is a pretty good case for prosecutorial discretion, but the governor is, as I said, in some jeopardy, and there might be an arrangement worked out. I'm not saying that anybody is suggesting this, and I'm not even saying that I'm exactly suggesting it myself, but there might be an arrangement worked out where in return for a resignation, that both criminal and civil liability would be waived. There would be an agreement not to go down those roads.
Oh, wait a second. Civil liability? That means that the women would not be able to sue him?
Well, that is one possibility, and because
wouldn't they have to agree to that themselves?
of course they would.
Yeah.
But the question is whether Governor Cuomo, and I know him a bit, and I have very reliable insider reports, as to his character and disposition. I think he will be tempted to dig in, perhaps under all circumstances, but certainly in circumstances in which he faces years of lawsuits that could ruin him financially. So it's a very complicated situation.
Yeah, it is, because the women who were his victims would have to say that in the name of, relieving New York State of this horrible governor, that they would sacrifice their opportunity to get. Yeah,
I'm not saying that they will do that or that they should, but I'm just trying to place the politics here in a legal context, which does not simplify the situation.
No, it definitely doesn't. We should clarify these alleged crimes, if they're proven, they are misdemeanors, but still, that's a misdemeanor is still a crime. All right, let us turn now to the evictions moratorium. This week, President Biden was asked about whether the CDC was going to extend the eviction moratorium that expired, and I'll take this first to you, Megan. He said, this is what Biden said: "I've sought out constitutional scholars to determine what is the best possibility." And he said, and he found that most constitutional scholarship is that it's not likely to pass constitutional muster, but there are others who say that it may, and it's worth the effort. So, hey, constitution, whatever, right? I mean, who cares?
Yeah, I think, first of all, this was, you had some time to think about this, and the best you could come up with was, maybe I found a guy who said I don't know, it might be a woman. I found this one person who thinks it might be constitutional. Everyone else seems to not think so. And of course, the Supreme Court has very clearly signaled that they're not going to find it constitutional.
Right.
But we're going to give it a shot anyway. This is terrible, right? This is just an abdication of the oath he took to uphold and protect the Constitution of the United States. But I think there's a kind of less remarked problem, which is, why are we having this moratorium? Unemployment is at 5.9%. We are literally record number of jobs openings. Twice as many as as far back as recently as 2014. We have twice as many job openings now. Households came out of the pandemic in better financial shape than they went into it. Half of the people on unemployment have been making more on unemployment than off, and that half is the bottom half, which tends to be the people who are most vulnerable to eviction. There's no economic rationale for this. There's not really a humanitarian rationale for it, unless you want to say we just shouldn't allow people to get evicted because eviction is bad, and eviction is bad. But that said, it's very hard to imagine how you would have a system of private property without allowing landlords the right to evict people who do not pay their rent. And if you are not going to do that, then we're kind of at reimagining the entire American economy, which is not something I think, that's a project that the Squad is interested in. It's not a project that Joe Biden is interested in. And so rather, I think this is just, he understands he doesn't really want to do this, but he doesn't want to take the blame for it. So he's just sort of tossing this bone to his progressive base in the hopes that now the Supreme Court's going to take care of the problem for him. But that's really a kind of disturbing precedent. And what's equally disturbing is that the left would, if you think about how the media would have reacted if Donald Trump had said about a policy, well, I mean, sure, they're probably not going to be constitutional. Those dumb constitutional lawyers, what do they know? I'm doing it anyway because people would be going ballistic. We would be in the middle of our third wave of panicked editorials on the dark night of fascism descending over the land, and Joe Biden does it, and we kind of shrug. And this is not because I think, look, I voted for Joe Biden, and there's a reason for that. That said, the way that you protect the institutional norms that, as I recall, Democrats really cared about as recently as January, is by not cutting yourself special checks, special exceptions. And that is what is going on. And that is perhaps the most disturbing angle of this whole story, is not Joe Biden's really terrible justification for it, but the way that we have now reacted to that.
Yeah. Damon, Megan, makes the point that this is, in essence, if you're just going to sort of eliminate evictions as a remedy for landlords, and you're really sort of throwing a wrench into the entire capitalist system, which relies upon, counterparties doing what they're asked to do, and many landlords themselves are in fairly desperate situations where they've often been going without rent, but they still have to pay their mortgages, they still have to pay for repairs, they still have to pay for taxes. I mean, so the notion that this is the clear humanitarian thing to do, even that I find unconvincing.
Oh, so do I. This is not good. This is definitely a low point for Biden so far, in my opinion. I think we're probably, I don't know, when we get to Bill, see what Bill thinks, but I suspect pretty much everyone else for sure is not going to be very happy with this on this podcast. For everything Megan said, because of what it implies about sort of like the furthest progressive fringe of the left in this country, like, seems to have an attitude that, like, as long as anything bad or unjust is happening to anybody anywhere, we somehow haven't finished our work. We must remake the world so that no one gets evicted anywhere, no one ever, has to scramble to make ends meet, put food on the table. I mean, obviously, as a society, we put in place programs to try to soften the blows of capitalism and creative destruction and the other things that happen in life, but not without limit. And this is an example, as you indicated, Mona, along with Megan, where it seems like it's a solution in search of a problem given the current context. I would also add one more element to the bizarre quality of Biden's statement the other day about this that Megan didn't really emphasize. It's not just that he admitted that, well, yeah, most constitutional scholars think this won't pass muster, but I found a guy or girl to support it. He also indicated that he sort of assumes it'll get knocked down, but by the time the policy will have done its good, and so that's fine. It sort of made it seem like I can propose something that pretty much nod, wink, wink, we all understand is unconstitutional, but it'll take a while to work its way through the courts. And while that's happening, I can do whatever I want. That is, as you both indicated, like if Trump had come up with that kind of a rationale, well, I'll do this at the border, I'll impose this new regulation or get rid of this or that regulation because I or my base want it, and yeah, sure, it's going to be deemed unconstitutional, but that's going to take 5 months. For 5 months, we get to enjoy it. That's not the way you run a constitutional government, and I know that he knows better. And the fact that he's decided that he has to throw such a large bone to the left wing of the party on this is a little depressing for me, I have to say.
Yeah. To be clear, Trump did do those things. I mean, he absolutely did them, including.
But he didn't explicitly say.
Well, he did say.
Okay, what?
Go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I don't recall, at least offhand, him explicitly saying, yeah, this is unconstitutional, but it's going to take months for the courts to tell me that, and we're going to do it in the meantime.
But he did say something potentially even worse, showing that he completely misunderstands the Constitution, namely saying Article 2 says I can do whatever I want.
Well, yeah, sure. And Nixon said, Nixon famously said, if the president does it, it's legal.
It's legal, right?
So, yes, there are some precedents for this, but I don't think Biden wants to be looking to Nixon and Trump as his precedent.
Yeah, well, that's absolutely true. Okay, so Bill, Cori Bush, new Congresswoman from Missouri, slept on the Capitol steps. And made a big splash about this eviction moratorium. She's now one of the members of the squad, and she was aided in all of this by some of those those progressive congresswomen, but also not just by them. I mean, Chuck Schumer stopped by and said, "You did this. You guys are fabulous," and he embraced her. And Adam Schiff had his picture taken, and Dean Phillips, and moderates. So the left wing of the Democratic Party was asserting itself, and they succeeded. Because the moderates joined them, including Nancy Pelosi.
Well, I can't argue with that, although the left wing of the Democratic Party might very well have preferred to win the Ohio primary.
We'll get to that in our next segment.
Right. But I do beg to differ with a fair amount of the commentary that's preceded me. I've learned with interest that apparently nobody else on this show reads the Wall Street Journal, because if you had, you would have been in no doubt about where I stand on this. But here's...
I read your column, Bill. I know where you stand.
Yeah, well, nobody else did. And here is some context. The Congress of the United States, not once, but twice, decided that there was a major problem afflicting millions of renters across the country that could only be solved with an infusion of public money into the pockets of landlords to make sure that the landlords could pay their bills while ensuring that people who couldn't pay their bills would not be thrown out into the street. The latest survey from the Census Bureau, not well known as a partisan institution, found that there were 7.2 million households in imminent jeopardy of being evicted. That the aggregate debt is somewhere between $27 and $40 billion, depending on whether you believe Mark Zandi or some of the other people who've tried to estimate it. The median debt per indebted household in danger of eviction is many thousands of dollars, which they have no capacity of paying, even if they started working tomorrow, which many of them can't for various reasons. And what we're talking about is a failure of federalism. The administration of this program was consigned to the states and localities, which miserably failed to get any money out the door. Of the $46.5 billion that was supposed to be spent by now on this program, a grand total of $3 billion has been expended, screwing both landlords and tenants. And now the Biden administration, very inartfully, is trying to buy time to allow the states and localities to do what they should have been able to do months ago. And here we are. Is this a constitutional crisis on Trumpian scale? Hardly. It's a tale of ineptitude that includes the White House. For the record, by the way, the person that they rounded up to give them advice about this latest strategy was none other than Lawrence Tribe, uh, who is a major name, although hardly apolitical in these matters. So at any rate, I think we're hyperventilating a bit. That said, I do not think that the President of the United States should do something that he believes to be illegal or unconstitutional and then announce that fact. And that was not something that a president should do, and it was not Joe Biden's finest hour.
Linda, as Bill documented in his piece, the Congress authorized almost $47 billion to solve the problem of people who had lost their jobs and would otherwise be facing eviction during COVID. And only a tiny fraction of that money got spent in the way it was supposed to be spent. Is there a larger lesson here, one would think, about the efficiency of government, about the ability of government to solve problems? I mean, we are living in a moment where everybody just seems to be floating along on the assumption that the government is omnicompetent and capable of doing great things, and nobody stops to say, the less it does, the better, and the more it's narrowly tailored, the better. And yeah, write checks to individuals by all means. They're good at that. But devising programs and elaborate schemes to improve matters, a little skepticism is in order.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And yes, I think, about $3 billion of that almost $47 billion that the Congress allocated to cover rent for people who would in fact have been put out on the street has actually gone out the door. And that is the big problem. And as you suggested, it is much easier, much more efficient. And as we found certainly during COVID, writing checks to individuals managed to do a lot of good. It staved off poverty. I mean, we've had a reduction in poverty during the pandemic, which is, incredible in some ways. So, how you would end up doing this. But, I want to say a word here for landlords. And maybe I say it in a self-interested way because I am one. I come from a family. My grandfather was in the real estate business at one time. And I decided, when I was beginning to plan for a retirement in which I have zero pension, I have no money that will come to me except my Social Security check when I quit working, that I would buy some houses and rent them out. I'm a very good landlord. But if my renters don't pay me, I will default on my mortgages. I don't have the kind of money that I can just carry people forever. And I think that, one of the things, the way in which this was done, perhaps there should have been a way. I know that the current rules have a lot of paperwork entailed. And I guess part of the problem is sometimes the landlords are not very happy with their tenants and they may want to get rid of them anyway. And so maybe they're being negligent, but there should have been a way, given the huge number of federal employees we have working in the housing area, that they could have come up with rules and a way to get money out the door to stop the evictions from happening when the evictions were in fact truly going to put people out on the street who did not deserve to be put out on the street. And I think that's the other issue. I mean, I think Megan's point that we have very low unemployment, that we really have a jobs crisis right now. We're not talking about it much, but the fact is you cannot go anywhere without seeing help wanted signs in stores, in restaurants, everywhere. There is a difficulty now in finding workers. And so I just think that it's we're just assuming that all of the people that are refusing to pay their rent are really, law-abiding good citizens who, but for COVID, would have been making their payments on a regular basis. And I think that's naive. And I just, this idea that that you're going to have the president of the United States basically saying, well, we're going to do something even though we know it's probably not kosher. But by the time they catch us at it, maybe we will have figured this out. It is exactly right. This is exactly the kind of behavior that we have criticized Donald Trump for. And certainly he did a lot of things on the border that were unconstitutional, and he got shot down a number of times. But what would have happened if he had just simply, said, well, we're going to do it anyway? Well, he did in some cases say
Yeah.
that. But, there was a hue and cry. And I think
But
this is really
return
unfortunate.
yeah, and just to put a big line under your earlier point, incentives matter, and when people are, we can't romanticize human beings. I mean, when people are earning more collecting unemployment than they are working, of course you're going to have problems hiring people, and when you put on, continue a moratorium on evictions well past the point that you need to, then some people are just going to be taking advantage of that and not paying their rent when they should. And so it's just it's part of this romanticization of humanity that I think is a failing of the left in general. I'm being very anti-left today. All those people who were convinced I was moving into the Democratic Party may be having second thoughts. All right. Let's move on to the good news about the Democratic Party, which is that based on the results of some of these primaries, it looks like the moderates are winning. We had a special election in Ohio 11, Ohio 15. It was an 11-way race. And the winner was Chantel Brown. So let's start with you, Megan. Is this the, along with the other races that moderates seem to be doing well in, is this the message now that maybe Joe Biden is paying too much, and Pelosi for that matter, and the rest are paying too much deference to the progressives, because on the ground they're not doing well?
Yeah, this is a little bit surprising for me because I love Nina Turner, the progressive candidate who lost. I mean, look, we don't agree on basically anything politically, but she was the opener for Bernie Sanders at a lot of rallies in the pre-pandemic times.
Right.
And she's an amazing talker, and she really, she's passionate, she's engaging, she speaks just like beautiful flowing prose roaring out of her mouth. It's really, a great show, and I really enjoyed it. And so I'm a little surprised that she didn't do better. And I think that it does tell you something about where the party is versus where the party thinks it is. And I think this also goes back to something that people have been saying for a while, which is Twitter is not the real world. You have this terrible situation where not just journalists, although journalists are a big problem, but the whole political class has gotten captured by social media, where they can all see each other talking at once, where they can enforce a set of social norms that push people farther and farther away from where the center of even the Democratic Party is. And yet, because you see it all the time, right? Anything that is happening to you constantly feels like it must be some sort of universal truth rather than a very personal, very local phenomenon. And so they tend to think that what they're seeing on Twitter in some way represents the voice of the American people. And so they think that things like like eviction moratoriums, they're not really actually very popular anymore because people understand that we've recovered and we don't need to do that. They were popular at the height of the pandemic when people couldn't go out, and they were worried that people would go out and, first of all, spread infection, and second of all, lose their jobs and be out on the street. But people aren't worried about that now. But because the left is so vocal and so able to coordinate on Twitter, people listen to them far out of proportion to what their actual electoral influence is. They can win in districts that are really, really, really far left. But those aren't the districts where most of the people in the United States live. They're just the districts where most of the political class lives. And so I think this has created a terrible optical illusion that is exacerbating a tendency that was already ongoing in both parties, which is that there's been a decline of what you might call actual representation for grassroots movements. So if you think about what's the heart of the Democratic Party traditionally, it's the labor movement. Certainly in the 20th century anyway, right? Well, the labor leaders are elected by their membership. They are, in some ways, really representative of that membership, and they are directly accountable to that membership. If they make the membership mad, the membership can get rid of them. And if you contrast that with who is now the voice of of various policies in the Democratic Party, it's these activist groups that don't represent their community in the same way. It's not like Black America got together and elected Black Lives Matter, and yet they're treated as if they are representative, as if they have been chosen as the voice of their community, and as if they're kind of negotiating on behalf of that community with you. They're not. They're negotiating on behalf of a much smaller membership that is often really not representative of their community. And you see this with the emergence of Latinx, which is something that a recent poll just showed 4% of Hispanics, which is what they chose. They did a poll of Hispanics. 4% of them preferred Latinx. The overwhelming majority, the majority choice or the plurality choice was Hispanic. But Latinx had become super common, pushed by activists who were engaging in coalitional politics, right? It was a trade-off with feminists, with transgender activists and so forth, but it wasn't something that was organically part of the community, and they weren't really authorized to make that trade. But journalists who were not Hispanic had treated it as if they were actually authorized to make that trade, and that we now all had to shift because that was, the new locution. And this is a very small thing. I don't think it matters in any cosmic sense, but it does matter in that I think it shows a real problem for Democratic Party politics. And I think Republicans have their own version of this, by the way. But I think that at the moment, what is most apparent is that where the party thinks it is really, really different from where the party actually is, in a way that I think, frankly, we center-right intellectuals were in that position in 2015, and that is going to have to be rectified for the party to move forward.
So, Damon, in Louisiana, too, the moderate won. In the Virginia governor's race, the moderate won. In New York City, the moderate won. And here in this Ohio race, you had AOC, campaigning for Turner. You had Bernie Sanders campaigning for, but on the other side, you had Jim Clyburn and Hillary Clinton and other members of the Congressional Black Caucus weighing in for Brown. And it's a clear lesson, isn't it, about where the power really lies in the Democratic Party, where the real sort of center of gravity of the party is?
Well, sure. Although I would want to slightly amend the way you put that. It's not really about the power, because the activists have enormous power, and even
true. Yes,
and even I love what Megan was saying about especially the contrast between the labor union movement and its influence within the party versus activists today. But the other component is, of course, the donors, the very wealthy people who are funding these activist groups, who then go out and claim to speak for the voters when they in fact don't, and very often say things that rank and file Democratic voters don't know anything about, don't particularly care about. On the Twitter dimension, I would just go back briefly to the Ohio election and point out that Nina Turner has 485,000 Twitter followers and Shontel Brown has 27,000. Looking at that, there's no way that Brown could win, right? That's like ridiculous. Ha.
And she was outraised also.
Yeah,
Turner outraised Brown by something like $3 million.
Sure, and that points to another way in which these things often play out in our politics now among both parties, that one of the ways that things work out somewhat kind of surprisingly sometimes is that those who are most motivated, most informed, most committed and engaged with politics have outsized influence on what the parties do, because they're the people who show up and come to the meetings and carry signs and chant and get engaged. Whereas a lot of people who are a little bit more kind of center left or center right, don't pay attention to politics that much, don't watch Fox, don't watch MSNBC, don't hang out on Twitter all day long like all the nice journalists I know, following the news every single day and every bit of minutia. Those you have this kind of discrepancy in kind of a different kind of power, the power of organizational oomph. And so what you end up with is the appearance that someone like Nina Turner, oh, she's definitely going to win. She speaks well, and I'm a journalist, and I care about how people speak. That's very, very important to me. If they're articulate, I love that. And, I'm a journalist, I must be very progressive, and so I admire what she's trying to do. And even if I didn't vote for Bernie, I voted for Elizabeth Warren instead, and she obviously was the best person, but she lost too. Like, there's this complete misallocation of reality and hope among a lot of people who follow politics. And we saw it most memorably, of course, in the 2020 Democratic primaries, where every smart person, and I even include myself, ironically, in describing using that term, used analysis of these different primary debates and some of the early primary contests, and just assumed Biden's got to stumble, he's got to go down, he's got to capsize. You've got all these great progressives in there who are tapped into all that energy and the money on the left, and in the end they faltered every time, and Biden came out on top because the actual voters in the Democratic Party, not overwhelmingly, but still at this point, they tend to be center left. And the last point I'll make is, you remember we talked a couple weeks ago on here of that Echelon Insights poll that really dug into the electorate and broke it down into different groups. And there was that question about, if we had 5 parties rather than 2, how would they work out? And it turned out that the smallest party of all is the far left, the kind of ultra progressive sort of Green New Deal AOC party would get somewhere around 10% of the vote. So, 10% of the vote, that's several million people. It's not nothing. It's not 2% of the vote, but that is only a tenth of the country. And so the idea that tenth would actually be controlling one of the 2 parties and determining its future, I think is unrealistic and probably better for the country as well.
Bill, Chantel Brown, the winner, said, quote, "This is about making progress, and sometimes that takes compromise. Because when you demand all or nothing, usually you end up with nothing," unquote. So I'd like you to dig in, if you would, a little bit to how Brown won this race. I mean, partly she pointed out how extreme Turner was, that she refused to say who she voted for in 2016. She famously compared the vote in 2020 to excrement, that found both candidates that unappealing. And Brown and her supporters were able to point those things out to voters.
Very effectively. This is a strongly African-American district. And as we learned during the Democratic primaries in 2020, most African-Americans are, when you get right down to it, quite moderate and realistic. They are not impressed by eloquence. They are interested in real results. As I listened to Megan, I was reminded of a famous anecdote involving the late lamented Mayor Marion Barry. And a journalist asked him, well, aren't you worried that Jesse Jackson is going to mount a challenge to you for mayor of Washington, D.C.? And Barry didn't miss a beat, and he said, Jesse doesn't want to run anything except his mouth. There's a real sensitivity in the African-American community to people who talk big but haven't demonstrated the capacity to get real business done for the community and make their lives better. And so I think that Chantel Brown was appealing to exactly the same kind of constituency that Jim Clyburn did in South Carolina when he turned around South Carolina and the entire Democratic primary. And he said explicitly that that we know Biden and he gets things done for us, and he's not a morning glory here this morning and gone by evening. This leads to a broader point about the Democratic Party. This is based on some research that I did a few weeks ago. In every single national election where a Democratic candidate has come out on top, this goes back many, many cycles, moderate voters who call themselves moderate have contributed a larger share of the candidate's total winning votes than people who call themselves liberal or very liberal or progressive. And Joe Biden's victory in 2020 was no exception to that. And by a considerable margin, moderates contributed more votes to his winning coalition than liberals and progressives did. And that despite the fact there has been a shift in the center of gravity in the Democratic Party. There are some districts where you can win by situating yourself within the midpoint of the Democratic Party. But there are many other districts and states, and surely the country as a whole, where you tend to do better by approximating the midpoint of the country rather than the midpoint of a single party. And so there's a real optical illusion here that tends to magnify the political impact of the most left-leaning portions of the Democratic Party in a way that the facts simply don't bear out.
Okay, Linda, let's just take a moment to think about things in the Republican Party. There were two primary races where Trump endorsed a candidate. In one case, his endorsed candidate lost, and in another, his candidate won after he dumped some significant cash in at the last minute so that people wouldn't be able to say that he lost two in a row. On the other hand, he railed against this proposed infrastructure deal and didn't seem to have much effect on the Republican senators who are negotiating it and planning to vote for it. But is the Republican Party, in your judgment, getting to a post-Trump era or not?
I don't think we know entirely yet. I mean, certainly in the 15th Congressional District in Ohio, where the Trump candidate, who, by the way, was once described by apparently a Republican who remained anonymous, but a Republican called him the swampiest swamp creature out there. The candidate was Mike Carey. He was a lobbyist for 20 years for the coal industry. But he was running in a very, very crowded race. I think there were 10 other people in that race. But they included a state representative and a state senator, as well as the former Columbus, Ohio NAACP president. So you would have thought that he would not have come up with the kind of victory he did. I mean, he won overwhelmingly. And I think that he won, I guess, 37%. Well, it's not overwhelming. It's still a plurality. But the next best person did 13%. So obviously the Trump endorsement, I think, played a role in that. This is Ohio. Trump is still very popular in Ohio. It remains to be seen what this will mean nationwide. Whether it will have the kind of role that Trump has played in the past, whether he will continue to be able to play that role. I am betting that he won't. I am betting that over time his influence is going to diminish. It doesn't mean it's going to diminish in a Republican primary, in a congressional seat that is safely Republican. When you get a seat that, has only gone Democrat once since 1967, and that then only for one term, you're talking about a very, very Republican safe seat. And there where you have the hardest of the hardcore, Trump may still play a role. But I think the whole shift that we've seen in the Democratic Party is very bad news for the Republicans coming in the 2022 election and in 2024. The more moderate that the Democrats become, the more that people who are either independent or may even have been Republican but really despise Trump can be comfortable with voting for a Democratic candidate, the worse it's going to be for the Republican Party. So I actually think the news out of this spate of special elections is good news for the Democrats and may not be good news for the Republicans.
I agree. All right. Let us now turn to our highlight or lowlight of the week, and I'll start with Bill Galston.
I want to announce the eruption of a new scandal in Washington, D.C. I will call it Whiskey-gate. Here's the background, ladies and gentlemen, all over America. The Japanese government, in gratitude for something or other during the previous administration, sent the Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, a bottle of whiskey valued at $5,800. The bottle cannot be located. It was not sent to the National Archives or suitably accounted for. Where did the whiskey go? If it has been consumed, who consumed it at $500 a sip? The American people are demanding answers to these questions, and I'm here to bang the table on their behalf.
All right. Linda.
Okay, well, I'm going to go from that very funny one to something a little bit more serious, but very important. And that is a study that was out this week from the Center for Migration Studies of New York, which gives the best estimate on the population of undocumented persons in the United States. You know, when we see all the stories of 180,000, 200,000 people being apprehended at the border, I think the impression is left with most people that we have a flood of tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of undocumented persons coming into the United States. And it's just an inaccurate picture. Part of the reason that we get that impression is that the best documentation that we have for the population of undocumented on a month-to-month basis is the number of people who are apprehended at the border. And that's often used as a proxy to try to let us know what's happening in terms of that population. But the more serious issue is how many people actually get in and stay here. And it turns out the undocumented population has gone down. The most recent number is that there are 10.35 million undocumented immigrants. That is down significantly from the period in 2010. That population, by the way, many of them, 38% of them, are parents of U.S. citizens. And by the way, 59% of that population speak English well, very well, or they only speak English. So I think this is some news that should calm some of the fears from people who somehow think our country is being overrun by illegal immigrants. It's not quite what it seems when you only hear the figures of the people who are apprehended, most of whom are in fact immediately turned around and sent back across the border.
Okay. Damon Linker.
Well, this week I want to highlight an essay by, I think, someone who's a friend of some of us here on the podcast, a writer named Kathy Young, who's made a career out of trying to develop and defend a very thoughtful kind of centrist politics that I think is somewhat close to many of us here. She has a very good long essay in the online publication Arc Digital, which is small but growing and could use more readers. So I encourage you to take a look at them and perhaps subscribe. But this essay in particular is important, and is so important that they've actually put it outside the paywall. So you can get to it without paying, but don't do too much of that and be a free writer. The essay is titled "The Reality of Quote Race Realism and Why It's the Worst Possible Way to Fight Wokeism." Or wokeness. Kathy, in this piece, examines a new book by Charles Murray titled Facing Reality, Two Truths About Race in America. Murray, one-time widely admired figure on the conservative side of things, who got into a lot of controversy over his book in the early 90s, The Bell Curve. He's very, very, very polarizing figure, with many on the left refusing even to engage with him because they claim he is a racist. He likes to examine problems of race. He likes to look at questions of IQ and to muse about whether discrepancies in racial behavior and outcomes and so forth are traceable to that. And again, very, very controversial. This new book is so controversial that it's been reviewed in very few places. But Kathy looks at it, looks at how it's been reviewed, watches some podcasts in which Murray lays out his position, and assesses it as really not being very good and really being sort of what his critics tend to claim about him. So it's a very worthwhile essay to look at closely and to get a sense of what Murray is all about, what the controversy is about, and to see why the way he handles these questions maybe isn't quite as careful as they should be. And they are big questions in our politics right now.
I have read Murray's new book, and I endorse your recommendation of Kathy's piece. I think she made the right points. Okay, Megan McArdle.
Representative Cori Bush, already mentioned on this podcast for sleeping on the Capitol steps in a protest over the eviction moratorium, has recently come under fire because it turns out that over the last 3 months, she has spent $70,000 of donated funds on providing personal security for herself. When asked if it was not hypocritical to spend that money while simultaneously calling for the police to be defunded, she told CBS News that she had to do this because the alternative was that she might be in physical danger, and told her critics to suck it up. She then pivoted immediately from that to saying, and defunding the police has to happen. This is all too common an attitude on the left. If you look at this, is not that important because it tells you something big about Cori Bush. What it does tell you is about the way that the left is often looking at this issue, which is that the people who are advocating, the academics, the activists who are advocating for defunding the police, often, and the journalists who give them, lavish airtime and a respectful hearing, are not living in the neighborhoods where violent crime is at the worst. The people left in those neighborhoods don't want the police defunded precisely because they can't afford to spend $70,000 paying for private security. And it's those people, not the people who have elegant academic theories about defunding the police, but the people who have to live with the actual results, that we should be listening to when we talk about something like that.
Amen. All right. I would like to praise Jonathan Chait in New York Magazine, piece called The Madness of Teachers' Unions Opposing a Vaccine Mandate. And he points out that, first of all, if you look at who has been hurt by the lack of in-person schooling over the last more than a year, it has hurt white students, yes, but it's hurt Black and Hispanic students considerably more, which should not come as any sort of a shock to anyone. And he says, well, the teachers union said that they might be in danger of catching the disease from their students. And that's why the schools there shouldn't be in-person schooling. Fine. So now we have the vaccine, but the teachers unions are now opposed to vaccine mandates. And furthermore, they're even opposed to having teachers be given priority for vaccination. It's just beyond belief. And by the way, he gave a shout out in the piece. He said, not all the unions were taking this kind of very unhelpful position. He cited AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka, who had endorsed vaccine mandates, and alas, we just learned that he passed away today. But in any event, the National Education Association is not covering itself in glory here, and neither are other teachers' unions, who are simply, pretending to be speaking for the welfare of students, but really seem to now be saying that not only do they want to keep their members safe, but they want to keep their members from even having to work. All right. That is all for this week. We thank Megan McArdle for returning, and we thank you all for your letters and emails. I read them all, even if I cannot answer all of them. And we will return next week, as every week.